Kia ora, Markie here. I've been asked a question, and these days when people ask me questions, I don't give them answers or reply by text or email. I shoot a video. So I've been asked. So it's great to be asked things because it kind of gets me thinking, and and I like responding to things this way. So the question I have had, and the questioner shall remain anonymous, is about repression. And is it a just along the lines of, is it something that's is it real for starters? Is it common? Can it be identified, and can it be treated? They may not be the exact kind of questions, but I think that's the kind of the spirit of it, really. So repression, repression is interesting. So what does the word mean? I mean, and it's interesting because there's a lot of words that are similar, aren't there? So there's expression, depression, suppression, and repression. Okay, and they all have the word press in there, which means pressure. So effectively, think to push down. Generally to push down. So certainly depression is pushing down. So expression is kind of is moving things up and letting things out, pressing things outwards. I suppose there's impression as well. Things make an impression on you. So impression, expression, depression, suppression, and repression. So essentially all to do with pressure, movement, something being pushed, if you like. So repression is about something. So interesting, the word re means again. So something's been pressed, so something's been pushed, and then it's been pushed again. Okay, so what we can interpret that to mean is something has been deeply buried. It's been pushed away big time. Okay, so repression does have a milder form or a milder equivalent, which is suppression. So suppression is something is pushed down, but it's not as pushed down as when something is repressed. Okay, so I'm kind of using all these words and talking about the similarities in the words, but we'll get into what we really mean by this. So what we're talking about is a psychological process. Okay. Now, whether Freud was the first one to talk about this or not, I don't know. He's probably one of the best ones to talk about it. So repression is where a memory can be completely buried. Okay. And we're not talking about kind of, where did I put my car keys? Okay. We're talking about trauma. Okay, so and by trauma, I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can define trauma, but I think in terms of repression, the best way to define it in this case is something which the psyche cannot tolerate. Okay, so something which is so much of a challenge to our mind, to our emotions, to our essence, that we can't cope with it. It's like something that we can't integrate or make sense of or deal with. So often it's something too shocking, frightening, horrifying, or something that doesn't fit with our core beliefs, something which is so alien or antipathetic to our sense of what's right and who we are. Okay, so what kind of things get repressed? Well, the classic really is abuse, but things like car accidents, war trauma, all kinds of things can get repressed. So does that mean that we literally don't remember them? Yes, it does. They're pushed down. They're buried so deeply that we don't have access to them. Does that mean that we don't have to worry about it and it's done and dusted? Problem solved. Bish bash bosh. Unfortunately, no. Okay, so Freud describes this beautifully with the analogy of a meeting. Okay, so there's, excuse me, clearing my throat. I'm drinking creamy coffee here actually, and that's kind of it's lovely. It's making making me a bit of a frog in the throat. So I'm still going to drink it. And that isn't product placement, by the way. It's sort of Nescafe. I don't actually approve of Nestle. Just happens to be the biggest cup that's available. That's how I choose my cup, the biggest one. So what did Freud say? Markie, get on with it. Freud said, picture a meeting. Okay, and somebody is speaking in the meeting. They're delivering a speech, say, a public meeting in the town hall, let's say, okay. So somebody is trying to deliver a speech about something, and a member of the audience keeps getting up and shouting and barracking the speaker, and becoming really disruptive. So it gets to the point where the meeting can't continue. It's completely disrupted. So a couple of burly guys from the meeting think, right, well, we can't have this. So they kind of manhandle the noisy person that's been interrupting the meeting, and they unceremoniously drag him out of the hall, throw him out the doors, and then lock the doors. Problem solved, you would think. Okay, so that's kind of repression. So the thing that was too disruptive to be tolerated has been removed. Okay, which sounds good, doesn't it? However, the next thing that happens, and this is in Freud's story, is the guy starts hammering on the door. Okay, so he's still disrupting the meeting, not to the same extent, because he's there's a door between him and where everything else is taking place. So it's not perhaps as noisy or as disruptive, but it's still pretty difficult, causing lots of problems. Okay. So what happens is one member of the audience takes it upon themselves, or maybe he's elected by the group, to go outside and find out what the problem is with this guy that's hammering on the door and causing all this disruption, to see if some kind of agreement can be made with this person whereby they're able to come back into the room and behave themselves, and enable the meeting to continue. Okay, so in that analogy, in that story, the speaker at the meeting really is the psyche, is your mental health, if you like, and continuing to speak is the function of that's your mental health and your wellness and your way of being, continuing in a healthy, happy, undisturbed way. Okay, the man that starts kicking off at the meeting is something so difficult that arises, that's so traumatic that you can't continue to function. So the people that throw him out of the door are the psychological processes. So this is an inbuilt, I like to think of it as a bit like a psychological immune system. So a psychological process whereby these guys throw the man out of the room. That's a natural process. We don't have to think about that. It's not something we choose to do. That's something that the mind, the psyche, kind of takes upon itself as a kind of automatic immune response. And you think that would solve the problem, but it doesn't, because the repression mechanism, is pretty good, but it doesn't remove this thing from all trace. It still causes problems, and the kind of problems that we're talking about here are illnesses or psychological problems. So they could, in theory, could emerge as all kinds of things. Could emerge as a phobia, or could emerge as an aversion to something, or any kind of psychological problem. So in theory, all kinds of things could present as depression, could present as anxiety. Okay. Or could present as a physical illness, because that energy's kind of got to go somewhere. So it could present as, and in Freud's day, they talked a lot about, they called it hysteria back in the day, but basically physical symptoms that had an emotional cause, and they could be treated through psychotherapy. So, and this is kind of things like somebody couldn't feel their arm or couldn't use an arm, and then they'd have psychotherapy and they get the use of the arm back. So that's the kind of symptoms that but all kinds of symptoms, or just a general sense of, being ill at ease, or nightmares, is the other one. So the man who goes out to negotiate with the person that's hammering on the door is the therapist. Okay, so the therapist's job is to, first of all, find out what it is that's been, the nature of the person that's been thrown out of the meeting, what their beef is, what their issue is, why they're disrupting the meeting, what they want to say, what their issue is. That's the first thing, and then they begin a negotiation of how that part of the psyche, which is what it is, or how that the memory of that event can be safely reintegrated into the mind, which is the meeting as well. The meeting is also the mind. So that is the nature of repression. So how do you know if you have some repressed trauma or repressed memories? Well, you don't. Okay, it's not, it's not something you can kind of test for, but the method of psychotherapy that Freud pioneered, and which is still going strong today, is very good at working with that, but it's not an easy process. Okay, and the therapist is one of the reasons why psychoanalytical psychotherapists are so well trained, and often they're trained for about 7 years, and they undergo their own treatment, which could be about 7 years as well. Okay, and that treatment sometimes is 4 times a week. Okay, and what happens is the psychoanalyst is trained to observe the kind of clues to the repressed material that emerge from some of the things that the person does and says, from their dreams, and from all the kind of unspoken stuff, if you like, or the stuff that leaks out of somebody. So when somebody goes for psychoanalysis, the psychoanalyst isn't just listening to the words they're saying, they're listening to what's between the lines. They're picking out on certain phrases that somebody might use, or when somebody's talking, they might put their hand in a certain place. Very, very subtle, nuanced stuff. Okay, and then once the psychoanalyst starts to get a sense, sorry, that's a phone beeping. We hear the phone. Once the psychoanalyst starts to get a sense of whether there may be some repressed material, their job is to bring it to the attention of the client so it can be reintegrated. But they don't just blurt it out. They may have a working hypothesis that this is something like the nature of the material that's been repressed, or the event that may have happened. And often what they'll do is they'll hold on to that for quite some time, working with the person to a point where and helping build their readiness for them to reintegrate that repressed memory, that repressed part. If they just blurt it out, it can be very dangerous, because why did the psyche block out that thing in the first place? Because it was too traumatic, too dangerous, too earth-shattering to be allowed to be experienced. So the therapist doesn't just sort of say, I think you were sexually abused by your mother when you were 3. That would be horrific. But the therapist knows how and when to start bringing that person's awareness in that direction, so that it's like gently guiding in the person that's been locked out of the meeting. Okay, so they don't just fling open the doors and let the person come charging in, shouting and screaming and maybe kind of being violent. Okay, so that's one of the reasons, why, one of the things really to, I think that shows where therapists can be undervalued, because in order to do this process, they have to do it themselves, and it can be agonizing. And it's incredibly expensive. So, for example, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I'm a psychotherapist, and I use some psychoanalytical theory. But the training of a psychoanalyst is, it's enormous. I actually come across people trained as analysts, and they've worked out that if they put the cost of all their training together, it's the equivalent to the cost of a house. It's like buying a house, no mortgage, just straight out cash to the equivalent of the cost of a house. Okay, and therapists, they don't get rich, generally speaking, because it's the old adage: you're being paid for your time. Okay, so you can only do so much work, and because the work is potentially quite dangerous on a psychological level, you wouldn't want to be seeing too many clients. So they have to have ongoing supervision as well. So there's kind of a lot to it, really. So that's not the only way to deal with repressed trauma. So the other way that repression is kind of looked at, the lens and the context that is looked at more in mainstream mental health services is in the context of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, and there are other techniques like EMDR and things like that. But I suppose I'm talking a lot about the psychoanalytical approach, because that's where we learned about this stuff, and that's where a really solid skill and knowledge base was developed about how these things work and the subtleties and the really deep skill that needs to be done to work on that kind of level. So I'm not saying that's the only way that this kind of thing can be addressed, but that's kind of where it comes from, and that's certainly where the language of things like repression come from. So just quickly, suppression is where something is minimized and pushed down, but not to the same extent as repression. So repression is beyond your memory. You're not able to access that memory. Suppression is kind of it's like something it's just within your reach, but quite difficult to see. It's a little bit like trying to look at something in your peripheral vision. It's a bit like if you have a floater in your eye that's in the corner of your eye, and you can't look at it directly, because if you move your eye, it's still in the corner of your eye and you can't quite see it. So that's what suppression is. Suppression is a milder form, really, of repression. So I hope that's helpful. I can talk some more about PTSD and the kind of the kind of context that people look at this thing more in today. If you'd like me to do that, if you've got any questions, let me know. It's fascinating stuff, really. And very real. There's a lot of hard scientific evidence for this. I've certainly experienced, lots of people who. The other thing as well is a repressed memory can be triggered by a current event. So if something is very similar to the event that's been repressed occurs to somebody, and it might be kind of background stuff. So if somebody was abused, I don't know, say in a yellow room with a particular record playing, for example, some of those circumstances, if they're replicated, somebody's, in similar circumstances or hears the same record, then it can kind of spontaneously come back, which is very scary and traumatic. And usually that brings lots of problems, the way it's come back very violently and very unexpectedly, and people need therapy to help to kind of re-embed it, really. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Put questions in the box below. I'll do my best to answer them. Rangimarie.